videos of the.
I'm going to go ahead and switch now to show. I'm going to go ahead and switch now to show you guys some of the app. I'm going to pop the audio here as well. So here is the app, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time just showing you some of the sound. So as you tap, notice that the music changes ever so slightly. So the subtlety really adds a nice cinematic feel. So it's a combination of sort of music, sound effects, and using them really intentionally. Let's look at the animation next. And so here, as you see, we're introducing one panel at a time. And it's very intentional, it's paced, it only goes as fast as you tap forward. I'm sort of speeding through it here. You can hear certain sound effects will come in and add sort of punctuation on top of an ambient sound in the background. It's a very subtle approach to creating a cinematic reading experience, so to speak. We really want the words to come forward and the sound to sort of support that and the motion to support that. And so it's not really about overwhelming it with too much motion and too much sound. We talked about Ajax being built in a game engine, and it's very hard to tell, but at the very end here, as the paper sort of rolls off the screen, you can see that it's actually 3D objects. They are rotating ever so slightly. So we didn't push that much in the app, but there's an opportunity to do that, I think, going forward. And as you mentioned before, there's supplemental content throughout the book.
Well, instead of watching myself talk about myself, let's just see if this works.
Did you make a decision to not just take out the written dialogue of these voice actors?
Well, that would, I think, change it because then you can't control the pace as much. And we really want it to be a reading experience.
Couldn't have just played at the same time as the bubbles played?
Yeah, you could, but I think at that point, you know, I mean, it's hard to explain. You kind of have to like be reading it to see, but we wanted to not do spoken dialogue intentionally. Like it was a creative decision.
It was a joke.
Yeah, you could of course do it. I think it just fundamentally starts to change, you know, what the experience is pretty fast. And then if you want to localize it or do other languages, it becomes a big headache and far more expensive. So, oh sweet, Ajax. See all the crap on my iPad. It's awesome. A little bit of Temple Run. There we go. All right. Wow, that works pretty well. That's awesome. Oh, but you can't hear the audio. Damn it. It's okay.
Do that as well.
Sweet. All right, I can stay tethered to the table. It's fine. Fabulous. All right, so basically, I'm just sort of swiping through this thing now. But you can go forward and backwards. So I think if it was like reading audio out loud and you wanted to go backwards really quickly, you'd have to like fade the audio out, and it could become like a real challenge. Because audio, spoken dialogue is a very linear experience, and if you want to quickly jump around like you would in a comic book, it would make that very hard and very technically difficult. So I think for us, it really just became more about, you know, well, I think it's actually better in some ways when you read it yourself because you kind of make that jump. There's this really good Andrew Stanton TED Talk, even though his latest movie wasn't much of a success. He talked about making the audience sort of work for their lunch, right? And how you give them 2 + 2, but you don't give them 4. So I think in a way, by not giving them everything and just giving them the sort of 2 + 2, by trying to figure out how the character sounds yourself, you get that extra leap of creative contribution that you don't really get when, you know, it's all sort of spoken to you. So I'll show you some of my favorite parts of the animation. You guys already saw the note about the audio. Let's see here. This is one of my favorite pages in terms of animation. So you get this really cool dynamic composition where the content sort of rearranges itself, reshapes. So these soldiers are ordered to fire on Iranian protesters, and one of them says, "No, I'm not going to do that," and starts to take off his uniform. This is very well. You get a lot of very cinematic feel from very simple suggestions, just by a little bit of motion, but letting the illustrations really come forward. And the essence of, I think what makes a comic book is really maintained by that. Because if you think about it, when you're actually reading this thing, this is an identical experience right now to a comic book, except it's a comic book that only has 2 panels on the page. And now it's a comic book that has 3 panels on the page. And now it's a comic book that has 4 panels on the page. And so there's motion in between these rest points, but when the story is actually being delivered to you, it's exactly the same tools that a print book uses. But we're able to, instead of trying to replace that with motion and sound, we're trying to use motion and sound in between those moments, right? Which if you think about the start and stop, right? Film is very linear because you basically you're in for the whole ride and you don't really get to pause it. And I think interactive filmmaking's really struggled with that because it's very hard to interrupt somebody or stop something, right? But comics, by their very nature, have a start-stop in them, from panel to panel, from page to page. And so there's a lot to play with there as an interactive storyteller because that pause is natural and it's built into the core experience. I'll show you some other cool things we did with this being a historical story and all. So for me, the desire here was to really get people to understand the history. And all of this really cool presentation we did was just something that I came up with because I wanted to make it interesting visually. But the essence really was to get the story across. That was really sort of the core goal of this whole project. And so now that we were on the iPad, we found ourselves with all this research material that we were going to sort of like maybe stick into the printed book with like a photograph section and stuff like that. But we could do so much more because you can not just only play, or show photos, you can play audio files and you can also stash, video and things like that, and actually entire documents. So every once in a while you can actually pull up additional information on the page, and this is supposedly the document he's reading in Farsi. So I'm just doing 2 fingers. Anyway, because anyway, and so we ended up with all this extra material, and the question was like, how do we within the narrative itself actually mention or call this stuff out? And so I ended up reworking the first chapter to actually build that into the core narrative itself. And so here we have our narrator is an ex-CIA agent reflecting on his past. So alone, so lonely. And he's like pulling the CIA files off the shelf, and the Ajax was actually the CIA name for Operation Ajax. And he lays the files out on the table, and I'm like, how cool would it be if you could go to that office and actually read those files? So I think this thing will actually spin. It's so cool. All right, so now you turn the iPad sideways, kind of like how in Torso, right? You would move the book around, and you can actually like read up on any of these characters, like Shah Baran, for example. So you have all these dossiers, these CIA dossiers with like photos in them. No, darling. Anyway, so we have Z sorting in the one that's live. This version, unfortunately, doesn't do that. You can like feng shui them, the corner. It's like Tetris. You make them disappear. Anyway, but yeah, in terms of making text interesting, like reading text kind of sucks. Unless you're really into reading text, it's hard to get people to care about that stuff, especially in our media-saturated world. Everyone wants, all sorts of bells and whistles. And so I thought, well, maybe by making it feel a little bit more alive, you could actually want to like read up, details on all these characters. So this is my way of trying to harness the tools of digital and interactivity to make that tactile experience deeper and richer than what a print book could offer. So we have like Americans and we have British, so all sorts of interesting characters here. But each of these people plays a really key part in the story, and they're all real people. So it's kind of cool to get that departure from the comic book world to the real world and use this as an intermediary. We actually have declassified documents that